step 3 of the SOP where we're working on loading samples. You can see I've got my sample substrate holder here ready to go. I've loaded a little glass slide onto it. Notice I've tacked it at least 2 points, and then because we're going to be using this for a test deposition, I've also put Kapton across the center here to block the deposition so I can measure it in the profiler. Please bear in mind that when you're using Kapton, the limitation on the tool is 50 degrees centigrade substrate temperature. Anything higher than that, you need to have a different mechanism for retaining your samples, chiefly because the glue will fail once you invert it. So I'm going to test that now and make sure that my sample passes the old Dairy Queen blizzard test. So turn it upside down, doesn't fall off, good to go. We're going to go load it into the system now, and just remember that it has to basically seat on the 2 pins on what we call a paddle. So here we are at the load lock. You can see that the paddle is already retracted all the way back to its home position, as indicated by the light on the little proximity sensor. Here's my 2 little pins. Those have to seat into the pins that are on the substrate holder. So I'm going to go ahead and invert, place it in here. Remember that it's going to be equidistant from both sides here, and you'll have about a millimeter overlap from the front of the substrate holder to the paddle. These grub screws back here should not be covered, and again, even distance on both sides. We've already wiped the gasket and the door seal, so we're ready to close this up, and we're going to basically pump down the system, or pretend we're pumping down the system. After you close the load lock and pump down the system using the load lock pump down routine, it's now time to transfer to the chamber. And because the chamber is now vented and the gate valve open, you can see that process in real time. So let's go ahead and open up the chamber. Here. Once I open the chamber and break this magnetic connection switch, I'm not going to be able to actuate the tower without closing the door, so we'll have to see that part. But as you can see inside here, your substrate receptacle, right, has to be aimed in this direction. That is, I need to have this opening, this surface right here, facing the load lock. There's only one orientation where you can put the substrate holder into and out of the substrate receptacle, and it's this orientation. How do you know that this angular or this rotational position is correct? Remember that you'll have a little clue right here on your manual knob that this plus sign will be facing out at you. When it's time to load a sample, it can be pretty forgiving. So if this is not perfectly aligned to the transfer, it's okay. It'll basically go in even if there's a slight angular offset. But on the unload process, it's very, very critical to get that correct, and we'll show you how that's done. Basically in this mode, remember that the chamber would normally be closed and under vacuum, the load lock would be under vacuum, and now it's time to transfer in. So you're coming in by dialing this little knob, right? And again, as soon as I move off of my home position, for the arm retracted position, my chamber light's going to come on, so that'll let you see inside a little bit easier through the viewports. I'm transferring along. You can see the magnetic piece is moving there. You can also grab this knob if you so desire. But basically, you're going to translate into the chamber to sort of a safe position, or a spot where you can see the substrate is entering the chamber, but you're nowhere near the tower. That is this whole assembly right here, which contains our substrate feeder. So this tower, remember, is going to translate up and down under the action of this motor, and it's that scenario that produces the risk for damaging or misaligning the system. If you descend this tower onto the paddle and pins aren't aligned properly, you're going to bend the entire transfer arm, which is what we just finished reinstalling after it was damaged. So, substrate holder moves into sort of a safe field of view, and now it's time to make sure that my tower is in the right position. So recall that my load and unload, or unload and drop-off position, is right here with this big black mark. So as I translate into the chamber, provided that my paddle has been properly aligned on the transfer arm, I should go directly into this receptacle here, and the substrate holder will basically move into this gap. So let's watch that happen right now. I'm going to get out of the way so we can film that a little closer. So go from this angle right here, and there we go. Now this is translating in. You can see that it sort of makes minuscule amounts of contact, translating in further and further and further. You can now see it appear through this little cutaway right here. Notice there's a gap between this bottom tang and the bottom of the substrate holder. So I keep translating in all the way until I hit a physical stop. So that's the back of the system. You can hear it now. Of course, you won't hear anything when the chamber door is closed because it's under vacuum. The physical stop, you'll feel it as you're translating in, but you also note that this big black holder right here, which is our magnet that translates this arm, it also hits this physical stop on this end and another physical stop on the other end. So this is basically the do not pass mark. So once I've gotten my system translated in like this, I now need to pick up the tower so that it lifts the substrate holder off of the paddle. And in order to show you that, I'm going to have to close the door because it doesn't like me moving motors with my fingers in the chamber. So I'm going to close the door, and we're going to film through this viewport so you can see that process. Okay, so now we're going to watch for the substrate holder to lift off of the paddle and be picked up into the substrate receptacle. So I'm going to go ahead and raise my tower height. I've driven up to about 15 millimeters height, you can see up here. And what you should be able to see in the chamber now is that the paddle is sort of free suspended below the substrate holder. Like so. So I can see through the window that the paddle is now empty, and guess where my substrate holder is? It's inside the substrate receptacle. You'll also note that the little pin that was visible on this side, very similar to the pins that are on the paddle, has seated up inside of the substrate holder, and therefore it sort of locks it in place inside the substrate receptacle. So you would then, of course, retract your paddle all the way back to the load lock, close gate valve, deposition, 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 and during that process, invariably, you will have been rotating the sample, right? Now the motor is going to do that for you. This is just the manual knob that I can use. But notice again, the orientation of the substrate holder with respect to the substrate receptacle. Remember that when it's time for me to unload, I have to aim this face towards the load lock. Otherwise, there's no chance of me unloading the sample. So remember that I'm going to position this black mark facing out at me, and that's just sort of a crude approximation of having this face of the substrate receptacle pointing towards the load lock. And here's the crux of the matter. When it comes time to come back in and unload this thing, it's not as forgiving as when you're loading the sample. So let's assume deposition has happened. It's time for me to go and unload my sample. I'm going to now do a little bit of a trick, and I want you to see what that looks like from a specific angle. When it's time to unload from here, you can pre-align the substrate receptacle to the paddle by doing the following. Drive the substrate stage all the way down to the unload position, and remember that your paddle must be in either the safety zone or still all the way in the load lock. You mustn't try to descend the tower with the paddle fully extended until you're aligned, or that's going to bend the arm. So, just for safety, let's get our paddle completely out of the way. And now I'm going to bring this tower all the way down to my unload position. You can see that, gotta close the door, genius. Sorry, still too smart for me. So now I'm going to bring the tower all the way down to the lowest position, that is the unload drop-off position. Right there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use the front edge of the paddle to align this box. So if I bring my paddle back into the chamber, what you can see from this end is that when I bring my paddle in closer and closer and closer, I may or may not be in perfect alignment. That actually looks quite good, so I'm going to exaggerate it to make it even worse. So let's assume that through the chamber port in the door, you see that the substrate receptacle is basically facing that way, and you see that you have this little plus sign right up here. That doesn't mean you're ready to unload the sample, because there is an angular offset between the orientation of the paddle and the orientation of the substrate receptacle. And you can see that most clearly by looking from this angle down here. So can you see the gap that you have right here? This is a problem because the substrate holder isn't going to seat on the paddle. At best, it will be sort of loose and prone to fall onto my precious instrument. At worst, it will actually generate a situation where you bend the transfer arm. So in this case, what we're looking at is a situation where we have a misalignment, and this is how you fix it. So with the tower all the way down in this position, you're going to come into the chamber and gently tap, tap, tap the actual substrate holder with the paddle. And if you tap that several times, I did that maybe 5 or 6 times, what you'll see is that those two faces have now mated up to one another, which means that I'm now perfectly aligned. If I now back up my paddle, we're going to raise the tower and drive back in, we're going to see the unload process. get my tower to a safe position for me to drive all the way in with my paddle. So that black dot right there, that's sort of a safe fly height. Now I'm going to drive my sample all the way in again to my physical stop. There we go. And now we're going to basically lower the stage inside here. And the most important place to watch is actually over here in this corner. You want to make sure that the edge of the substrate receptacle does not clip and deflect the paddle. You'll see the weight of the substrate holder move the paddle down just a little bit because it's a big heavy moly plate. It might deflect about a centimeter or so, but it shouldn't keep moving down as you're descending the tower. If you ever see that, stop what you're doing, you're misaligned, and you're bending the transfer arm. So here we go, watch that back corner, and you should see the paddle kind of disappear up into the substrate receptacle. Here we go. Lowering tower. So you see there it's starting to deflect a little further, and now you can see that the paddle begins to disappear up inside the receptacle. More importantly, if you look over here in this slot, you can see that there's now a gap in that oval cutout where I can see the substrate holder no longer resting on the tangs of the substrate receptacle, but rather resting on the paddle. And when I see that scenario, and I have proper clearance, now it's time for me to back the substrate system back out of the main chamber and into the load block. Let's see what that looks like close up. So again, remember here, the edge of the paddle has gone up inside here, and it didn't get clipped by this edge of the substrate receptacle, which is again tied to the tower. If this part gets hung on this piece, it's just going to bend the entire arm down. So always watch this corner. And then this little spot in here, this little breakout, you can see in this oval cutout there's a gap now that I can see through, and I see the little pin right there that held this thing in place. You see that sort of appear, and now it's time to draw it back out of the chamber, or back out of the substrate receptacle. As you're doing so, watch this end and watch the other end to make sure there's no obvious gaps or loose attachment of the substrate holder and the paddle. You don't want this thing rocking and rolling or wobbling back and forth, because if you lose it somewhere in the gate valve or lose it here, catastrophic things can happen. So I don't want to see any gaps here or here, and I want to see that I've slid all the way out without scraping or crashing into this piece. So that's the proper unload technique. You would now move all the way back into the load block. And if you go to vent the load block now, it will isolate the main chamber by closing this gate valve, and you'll be able to retain your precious sample.